Well, thanks a lot. So hello, everyone. My name is Michael Meaney. I am a visiting assistant research professor at Arizona State University and was formerly a Gates Cambridge Scholar at Cambridge, where I did my PhD. And today I will be presenting some qualitative work that explored the perspectives of producers who were working to build inclusive entry level massive open online courses. A quick outline. So I'm just going to say something briefly on some of the definitions I'm using. I will spend some time on what motivated this work and kind of motivates my work more broadly. Then I'll share kind of the central findings of the paper and then talk about some of the limitations and conclusions. MOOCs is a term that is widely used and can describe hundreds of thousands of courses online these days. And I'm using it specifically to refer to XMOOCs or edX and Coursera style MOOCs that are produced in the USA. Although they may host content from elsewhere, they're predominantly in English. They have no barriers to accessing content, but they may cost a fee for certification. And that's borrowing a definition from Dang, Benkendorf, and Ganaway from 2019. And then I'm also going to be speaking about traditionally underrepresented students and learners. There are many variables that are, or there are a lot of types of demographic variables that are traditionally underrepresented in the analog and in the online post-secondary world. For most of my work, I'm concerned about economic opportunity. And so I specifically look at human capital development through post-secondary education. And so I'm concerned with traditionally underrepresented in terms of users who don't have a tertiary degree or are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So I'd like to ground this work in what motivated me to pursue this line of inquiry. And so I know that many of us are familiar with MOOCs and have been around them for a long time, but I do think it's important to bring us back to some of the language that corresponded to MOOCs exponential rise in 2012 and 2013. So this is from Anant Agarwal, who helped found edX.org, and he said, up to now, quality education, and in some cases, any higher education at all, has been the privilege of the few. MOOCs have changed that. Anyone with an internet connection can have access. Instead of that being a retroactive straw man, as one of my committee members asked me, I'd like to point out that in 2022, these are the mission statements that are still on Coursera and edX. So this notion that MOOCs can help expand educational access, I think, is still quite pronounced. And then from 2019, we have a paper from Justin Reich and Jose Ruperez Valiente, which writes about 7 years after the year of the MOOC that MOOCs will not transform higher education and will probably not disappear entirely. Rather, they will provide new supports for specific niches within already existing education systems, primarily supporting already educated learners. And then some work that I shared at LAC a few years ago that was a compendium of a bunch of different data sets across a bunch of studies of MOOCs, looking at the educational attainment of those users. Well over 70% of users on average already held a tertiary degree when they enrolled and engaged with MOOCs. And so this is just quite a different portrait from what the original aspiration was. So there has been some work kind of broadly on some of the challenges that MOOCs face in reaching underrepresented learners. So they have been noted to have low quality instructional design. They have been noted to require a high degree of self-regulatory behavior. And among other reasons, the low instructional design and requiring a high degree of self-regulatory behavior make them particularly challenging environments for learners who have not had as much success in the existing educational system, and maybe some of the cause of why they've struggled to reach them. But what there was not a lot of work on was actually talking to the designers and producers of these MOOCs and asking them what was their approach and how were they thinking about like potentially hard to reach learners. How were they thinking about underrepresented learners at all? And so some of what was informing this work for me is this notion of inclusive design, and this is what inclusive design is defined as by the Cambridge Inclusive Design Toolkit. So inclusive design seeks to ensure that each product has a clear, distinct target users, and to backwards plan product development with those end users' needs in mind. And so that was kind of what like guided my ultimate investigation was, are producers making these considerations, and who are the end users that they're thinking about when they are designing? And so that's what led me to this work. And so when I was looking at the existing literature on producers of MOOCs, there was quite a bit of literature, but not answering the questions that I was particularly interested in. So first, there's a lot of work which documents the complexity of producing virtual learning environments. And there's this really interesting notion of third space producers that has come up a lot, and I'll share a little bit more about that. And there was ample investigation into the instructor perceptions and motivations and experiences of building and teaching massive open online courses. There was some investigation into inclusive design, although the lenses were quite varied. So some authors looked at disability, some authors looked at race, others looked at educational level. And this was always in international context, never in the United States. And from Layuna Warnagardena's first kind of highly cited literature review in 2013, all the way through more recent literature syntheses, there has been this call to explore the producer perspective more. And so that's what I looked to do in the context of the United States. So this took place at a research-intensive university that has a commitment in their charter for inclusive education. And the institution was producing a series of entry-level MOOCs, specifically a sequence of courses that represent entry-level university credits for first-year students and represent an earned admissions pathway. So similar to the competency-based pathway we heard about yesterday from the researchers from Finland, I believe. And so my question for these producers was, how are they considering traditionally underrepresented learners in their design processes, if they are doing so at all? And so I did a series of semi-structured interviews with professors, instructional designers, and program managers that were purposively sampled. I did a verbatim transcription that followed a modified orthographic approach. If anyone is curious about what that means, happy to share more in the Q&A. I share some of these quotes that are lightly edited. And then I conducted a thematic analysis, and I'll share more about these methods in a moment. And this was approved by the IRB of 2 universities, and I'm also keeping all of the subjects anonymous out of a strict sense of duty of care. So for my thematic analysis, I took 2 canonical approaches and kind of fused them. So the first is from Braun and Clark, and they're really excellent at helping you work a corpus of text into a series of codes and then into a series of initial themes. And then I followed methods from a paper by Atrides Sterling that helps you form those themes into these thematic networks, which is this really excellent tool for exploring qualitative data. So after I did this exercise, an inter-rater reliability process was followed, and there was substantial agreement. And so without further ado, I'll present the central findings. I just want to say that there was an ample corpus of words produced, and that while these results are limited by their sample size of the participants, and they're not generalizable for the context of the questions I asked, saturation, which is this very contested notion in qualitative research, was achieved insofar as that the codes and labels were exhaustively derived, like meaning that there was no further codes that could have been derived from the text corpus. And so I'm gonna spend the next 8 minutes walking through the thematic networks that were identified, and share some of the primary insights. So here's an example of a thematic network. In the center, you have the global theme. Each global theme is comprised of 2 organizing themes, and those organizing themes are comprised of 2 to 4 basic themes. And the basic themes that are in bold were slightly more prominent than the others. So the first theme that I want to share that I observed was that among the producers I interviewed, there was this sincere commitment to inclusion, and very sort of distinct conceptualizations of what inclusion meant to them. So as just 2 examples, I'll share. One of the instructional designers said, I think of everybody. I know that we have had students who went through our MOOC program because they didn't have the qualifications to get into the host university. So they used the MOOC program as a pathway to get into that university. And then the professor said, the people that are looking for a career change, they've already had, they're already successful, and they sort of know how to college, and yeah, they have already developed those study skills. So I share that because one of the primary implications of this paper is that while there was this sincere commitment to inclusion among the producers, the conceptualizations were quite distinct. And from a design perspective, that makes it very, very hard to serve your end user. And I think we heard in the last presentation how these sort of diffuse processes that have so many actors that all have different incentives and sort of alignment structures, that makes it challenging to identify and clearly articulate an end user that you are trying to serve. And sometimes that can lead to suboptimal outcomes. And so they were articulating these sincere and inspiring commitments, but they weren't like necessarily coherent across each other. The other interesting theme that I want to highlight from this thematic network is just how significant their personal and work backgrounds were. And so I really want to highlight how many of these producers did have some experience in the for-profit education sector, which kind of both served as a warning to them because they saw some of the more exploitive behavior that often has been observed in that sector. Like, for example, they noted that when they were working at a for-profit university, they marketed commercials during the times that that population was home. So between soap operas and, as cheesy as it sounds, like when Maury Povich was on, they would buy that time slot. And so that was a warning, but other interviewees described how these for-profit institutions were actually producing really high quality technology platforms and were extremely sensitive to the market needs of their users. And so I just thought that was interesting because it presents just an insight that I think is often not apparent in the academic literature, especially around what almost positive things we can learn from for-profit platforms. So the second theme that I will talk about having observed was just that there was a real commitment to innovative pedagogy and program design. And of course, there were some wrinkles in that as well. So these producers articulated sort of specific teaching philosophies. Like one said, you know, I'm a social constructivist. I'm not a behaviorist, and I always want my students interacting with the materials that I'm helping make. Another one of the professors created this whole section on industry moments so that they could link learning to the real world. And then so beyond teaching and learning methods, the program design itself was a source of innovation in their perspective, with this really compelling framing of this by the producer, saying that we are no longer going to deny any student. So if a student applied to the host university and they didn't fit in, they would be offered this sort of alternative pathway. And so just kind of two quick implications here. So while there was some articulation of kind of best practice teaching and learning, it was like almost out of date. A lot of the producers were like referencing things that they heard in grad school, and none of them were familiar with LAC or learning at scale or any of the sort of groundbreaking work that a lot of our colleagues are working in. And so I just thought that was interesting, and that echoes existing literature on the gap between research and practice. And then I just think it's worth noting, and again, as we heard yesterday from our colleagues from Finland, that competency-based admissions programs at scale really may have the opportunity to lower barriers for learners. And then lastly, and I'll just go over this one quickly, and we heard about it in the previous presentation in great detail, although not explicitly. There's a whole series of third space actors that are not professors, and they're not instructional designers, and they're not curriculum specialists. They're kind of like program managers and like platform managers and product managers that like work at all of these institutions. be they the universities or the technology vendors. And they just have different incentives, they have different processes, and all of those things are opportunities to embed interesting software that can enhance teaching and learning, but it also is a constraint because there's not access to all of that data. And again, it's hard to harmonize the objectives across all of these actors. And a lot of these actors end up having considerable influence of how these programs are constructed. So as I mentioned, this was exploratory in nature. It's quite small scale. It's not generalizable, and there could have been some better inter-rater reliability methods pursued. All that said, I think here are kind of my bottom line conclusions, is that inclusive design approaches may often be ad hoc and with gaps in perspectives across course production teams. There's an apparent gap between academic research and practitioner communities that echoes prior work. I think there's just more exploration needed of this role of the third space actor. And then finally, and I think most importantly, the original mission of MOOCs as providing more inclusive educational opportunities is not necessarily a lost cause. And I think in some ways it may be a design choice. And it forces us to kind of at least consider the possibility that greater focus and intentionality on producing courses and programs for traditionally underrepresented learners could produce like more inclusive outcomes at scale if some of these challenges that we identified are resolved. Thank you for listening.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions before we go to our break. Are there any questions either online or in person?
Hi, Ken Kadinger. Always happy to break the ice and asking questions. Michael, great, very interesting talk. I've been hearing lots about inclusive design in various forms, and some in other fields like like medicine. And I'm wondering, to what extent do we know more generally about success cases in inclusive design?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do think higher ed is not where I start when I look for success cases in inclusive design, to be honest. And I think there are some policy like barriers that might contribute to that. So like, for example, a lot of the kind of minimum competencies that universities have to set a floor with are like mandated by the state, and so that creates challenges. I do think there's a lot of inclusive design, like, well, so I'll just give an example. Instagram and Facebook, which is my former employer, but that's not why I'm using them as an example. I just need to disclose that. They do have this alt text now on they have an alt text option for all of their pictures, so that you can describe text for the visually impaired who may not be able to see the pictures. I think the Americans with Disabilities Act from the early 1990s established building codes that have tried to make accessing physical infrastructure much more inclusive. But I think the digital world in general, we have a long way to go, but there's also kind of some very positive examples as well. So it's a mixed bag, but I'm happy to follow up.
Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Michael, for that wonderful paper and presentation. That is the end of this session. We're going to take a little break. Yeah, please.